Hello everyone, I'm Ryan, and I'm here to guide you today through the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains. If you use this video to fall asleep, please like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get comfortable, and relax. The Stairs in the Hollow. Gabriel Torres didn't believe in mountain superstitions, which was exactly why he'd accepted the bet. His college roommate, Brian Mitchell, had dared him to spend a night alone on the Blackburn Trail, a section of the Appalachian wilderness that locals refused to discuss. Gabriel was 24, studying environmental science at UNC, with the kind of academic arrogance that came from reading textbooks instead of listening to stories. He'd laughed at the warnings, called them rural folklore for tourists, and packed his gear with the confidence of someone who'd never truly been afraid. Brian had come along despite his reservations, bringing his girlfriend Sophia Reyes and her younger sister Isabella. Sophia was 26, a nurse with steady hands and a practical mind, who'd insisted on coming because someone responsible needs to be there. She'd seen enough trauma in her 3 years working emergency rooms to recognize when someone was making a dangerous decision. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore hiking clothes that had actually been used before, not bought fresh for Instagram photos. Isabella, barely 19 and fresh out of high school, had begged to join, wanting to film everything for her YouTube channel about paranormal investigations. She had bright green hair that clashed spectacularly with the autumn forest, and an expensive camera her parents didn't know she'd bought on credit. She'd been posting videos since she was 15, building a modest following of 20,000 subscribers who loved her enthusiastic approach to ghost hunting. They started hiking at 4 p.m., which was Gabriel's first mistake. The ranger at the station, an older woman named Jean Hartley, with deep lines around her eyes and a voice like gravel, had told them explicitly not to enter the trail after 3 p.m. Her uniform was faded and well-worn, her hands scarred from decades of mountain work. Gabriel had smiled patronizingly and thanked her for her concern, adjusting his expensive GPS watch and checking his topographic map with the air of someone humoring a superstitious old woman. He didn't see the way Jean watched them leave, didn't notice her writing something in a worn leather notebook that looked like it had been carried for years, didn't hear her whisper "another 4" under her breath or see her reach for the phone as if contemplating a call she knew wouldn't change anything. The trail was beautiful at first, the kind of primordial forest that made you understand why people believed in old gods. Oak and hickory trees rose like cathedral columns, their trunks so massive that 3 people holding hands couldn't have circled them. The canopy was so thick the light turned green and golden, filtering through layers of leaves that had been growing for longer than the United States had existed. The air smelled of rich earth, decaying leaves, and something else. Something ancient and indefinable that made the back of your neck prickle if you paid attention. Isabella filmed everything, narrating in the enthusiastic voice of someone who'd watched too many ghost hunting shows. "Hey guys, Isabella here, and we are currently entering the infamous Blackburn Trail. Locals say this place is cursed, that people disappear here, but we're about to find out the truth." She panned the camera across the forest, catching the way the light moved through the trees, the shadows that seemed just a bit too dark, too complete. Sophia walked close to Brian, her medical bag bouncing against her hip. She never went anywhere without it. Years of emergency work had taught her to always be prepared. Inside were trauma supplies, medications, a satellite communicator her father had insisted she carry. Brian himself seemed nervous, his usual confident swagger muted. He was 25, worked in IT, spent most of his time indoors staring at screens. This hike was already pushing him outside his comfort zone, and they'd barely gone half a mile. He kept looking over his shoulder, though he couldn't have said what he was looking for. Gabriel led them confidently, consulting his GPS every few minutes, pointing out geological features and explaining the ecological systems with the enthusiasm of someone showing off knowledge. "See these rock formations? They're some of the oldest in North America. The Appalachians used to be taller than the Himalayas, but erosion has worn them down over hundreds of millions of years. What we're walking on is literally ancient, beyond human comprehension." He knelt to examine a peculiar stone, running his fingers over its surface. This sedimentary layer dates back to when this entire region was an ocean floor. That's fascinating, Gabriel, Sophia said with barely concealed sarcasm. But shouldn't we be focusing on making camp before it gets dark? She checked her watch. It was already 5:15 p.m. In October in the mountains, darkness came fast. We've got plenty of time, Gabriel said dismissively. I calculated our pace. We'll reach the clearing I marked on the map in 40 minutes, set up camp, and still have daylight to spare. He stood up, brushing dirt from his hands, missing the way Isabella had stopped filming and was staring at something in the trees ahead. Guys, she said quietly. Guys, is that a person? They all turned to look. About 100 yards ahead, barely visible through the trees, was a figure. Tall, unusually tall, standing perfectly still beside a massive oak. The light was wrong around it, the shadows falling at an angle that didn't match the sun's position. Probably another hiker, Gabriel said, but his voice lacked conviction. He called out, "Hello, beautiful day for a hike, isn't it?" His voice echoed strangely, the sound seeming to flatten and die faster than it should have. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. Just stood there, and now that they were all looking at it, there was something fundamentally wrong about its proportions. The arms hung too long. The head sat at a slight angle that would have been uncomfortable for a human. Let's just keep moving, Brian said, his voice tight. Maybe they didn't hear you. But none of them believed that. In the silence of the forest, Gabriel's shout should have carried clearly. They continued hiking, but the mood had shifted. Isabella kept her camera lowered, no longer narrating. Sophia moved closer to Brian, her hand finding his. Gabriel maintained his confident stride, but he'd stopped pointing out geological features. They all felt it now, the sensation of being watched, not by the figure they'd seen, which had disappeared from view as they walked, but by something else. Many things else. Eyes in the trees, in the spaces between trunks, in the shadows that seemed too dark and too deep. The first sign that something was wrong came at 5:47 p.m. Brian stopped walking and tilted his head, listening. Do you guys hear that? The others paused. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Nothing but their breathing and the blood pounding in their ears. It was the kind of silence that felt physical, pressing against your eardrums, making you want to speak just to break it. Isabella lowered her camera, suddenly looking much younger than 19, the green in her hair seeming garish and out of place in this ancient forest. That's not normal, right? It happens sometimes, Gabriel said, but he didn't sound sure. When a predator is nearby, smaller animals go quiet. Could be a bear in the area. But he knew that wasn't right. Bear presence didn't create this kind of silence. This was something else. Something that made every animal in these woods hold perfectly still and hope it passed by without noticing them. Sophia, ever practical, suggested they turn back. This doesn't feel right. I think we should head back to the ranger station. But when they looked behind them, the trail seemed different. The trees were arranged wrong, the gaps between them unfamiliar. There was a large boulder they definitely should have passed, but none of them remembered seeing it. The trail itself seemed narrower, the packed earth showing no sign of their footprints despite the soft ground. Gabriel checked his GPS. The screen flickered, showing their position jumping erratically, first placing them in Virginia, then Tennessee, then somewhere in North Carolina, all within seconds. The altitude reading was changing wildly, claiming they were simultaneously at 3,200 feet and 8,900 feet. His compass spun uselessly, the needle twitching like a dying insect, sometimes pointing north, sometimes south, never settling. It's probably just the iron deposits in the rocks, Gabriel said, his voice not quite as confident as before. Magnetic interference, completely natural. But his hand shook slightly as he pulled out a paper map, trying to orient himself by landmarks. The problem was, he couldn't identify any landmarks. The trees all looked the same now, massive and ancient and somehow hostile. The light was wrong too. Still the same golden afternoon glow, but it felt wrong, felt like it was coming from the wrong angle. Or like it wasn't quite real, like they were looking at the world through an old photograph. That's when Isabella screamed. She was pointing at something through the trees, about 50 yards to their right. At first, the others couldn't see what had terrified her. Then the perspective shifted, and they understood. Rising from the forest floor, incongruous and impossible, was a staircase. Not wooden, not matching the environment. It was ornate Victorian metalwork, the kind you'd find in an old mansion built in 1880. The railings were elaborate wrought iron with floral patterns, painted black but showing no rust despite being surrounded by decades of forest growth. The steps themselves were carpeted in burgundy fabric that should have been destroyed by weather and animals but looked pristine, recently vacuumed even. Brass fixtures gleamed in the strange light. The staircase ascended into nothing, disappearing into the canopy, leading nowhere. It was maybe 20 steps visible before it vanished into leaves and sky. But the wrongness of it went beyond the obvious. It was the way it existed in the space, not overgrown, not surrounded by debris but clean and waiting, as if someone had just installed it yesterday and was expecting guests. Gabriel felt his throat go dry. He'd read about these. Late at night, falling down internet rabbit holes when he should have been studying, he'd encountered the reports from park rangers, the theories on forums, the missing 411 cases compiled by that ex-cop who'd made it his life's work to document strange disappearances in national parks. People who'd found staircases in the middle of nowhere and had climbed them out of curiosity. People who were never seen again or who came back changed, walking on feet that barely touched the ground, speaking in voices that weren't quite their own, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "Don't look at it," he said, surprising himself with the urgency in his voice. All his academic skepticism had evaporated. Some things didn't need scientific explanation to be recognized as dangerous. "Nobody look at it, we need to move now." But Isabella was already walking toward it, her camera raised, filming, her YouTuber instincts overriding her survival instincts. This was the content she'd dreamed of, proof of something impossible, something that would make her channel explode. Sophia lunged forward and grabbed her sister's arm, yanking her back so hard they both fell to the ground, leaves and dirt flying up around them. "What the hell, Sophia?" Isabella shouted, genuinely angry now, her camera tumbling from her hands. But her sister's face was white with terror, her nurse's instincts screaming that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. She'd seen that look on patients' faces sometimes, right before they coded, right before their hearts stopped. The look of something being terribly, irreversibly wrong with reality itself. "We're leaving. Now." Sophia's voice had the kind of authority that came from working emergency rooms, from making life or death decisions in seconds, from being the one who had to stay calm when everyone else was panicking. She hauled Isabella to her feet, gripping her sister's arm hard enough to bruise. "Listen to me. We are leaving. Right now." They tried to move away from the staircase, but the forest seemed to resist. Branches caught their clothes with thorns that hadn't been there moments before. Roots appeared underfoot where none had been seconds ago, thick and gnarled and deliberately placed to trip them. The trees themselves seemed to lean inward, the gaps between trunks narrowing. The path they'd been following simply ceasing to exist, and always there was the sensation of being watched. Gabriel could feel eyes on the back of his neck, heavy and patient and infinitely old. He turned quickly, trying to catch whatever was watching them, but saw only trees and shadows, and the staircase in the distance, still gleaming, still waiting, and he could swear it was closer than it had been, even though they'd been moving away from it. Brian was breathing hard, his face flushed, one hand pressed against his chest. "Guys, I don't feel right. My chest feels weird." Sophia immediately switched into medical mode, checking his pulse at his wrist and throat, checking his pupils with a small flashlight from her bag, asking him rapid-fire questions. "Pain or pressure? Radiating to your jaw or arm? Any tingling?" His heart rate was elevated, but not dangerously so, rhythm regular, He wasn't showing signs of a cardiac event. But something was wrong. She was about to suggest they rest when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The watch on Brian's wrist, a simple analog with a leather band, was running backwards. The second hand ticking counterclockwise, time literally reversing, each tick taking them further into the past rather than the future. "Gabriel," she said slowly, keeping her voice level through sheer force of will. "What time is it on your phone?" He checked, pulling out his iPhone. The screen showed 5:47 p.m., the same time as when they'd first noticed the silence. Sophia checked her own phone. 5:47 p.m. Isabella scrambled for her camera, checked the timestamp on the last footage she'd recorded. 5:47 p.m. They'd been walking for what felt like 20 minutes, their hearts pounding, their lungs burning from the pace Gabriel had set, but time had frozen, or they had fallen out of it. Somehow they'd slipped out of the normal flow of time and into something else, somewhere else, a pocket of wrongness in the mountains. "This isn't possible," Gabriel said, but his voice was weak. All his scientific training was useless here. Physics didn't allow for this. Time didn't work this way. But the evidence was right in front of him. 4 devices all frozen at the same moment, while the sun continued its path across the sky, and their bodies continued aging, and their hearts continued beating. The fog rolled in then, thick and white and moving against the wind, pouring down from the mountains like something alive and purposeful. It didn't drift or settle. It flowed, moving with intention, seeking. It swallowed the trees around them, reducing visibility to mere feet. The world became nothing but white, and the sound of their breathing and the smell of earth and something else. Something that reminded Gabriel of old basements and standing water and things that had been dead for a very long time. And in that fog, they heard it. Footsteps. Not the crunch of boots on leaves, but something heavier, more deliberate. The sound of something massive moving through underbrush, but with a strange cadence, a rhythm that was almost right but not quite, like someone who'd learned to walk by watching humans but had never quite mastered it. Multiple sets of footsteps surrounding them, moving in a circle that was slowly, methodically tightening. Gabriel's academic confidence shattered like glass. Every rational explanation fled his mind as pure, primal terror took over, the kind of fear that lived in the oldest parts of the human brain, the parts that remembered when humans were prey animals, when darkness meant death, when the unknown meant teeth and claws and being dragged away screaming. "Run," he whispered. Then louder, his voice cracking. "Run!" They crashed through the forest, branches whipping their faces, drawing blood that they didn't feel in their panic. Isabella was crying, her camera forgotten and bouncing against her chest, the lens cracking against a tree trunk. Brian was struggling to keep up, his breathing labored, but Sophia kept one hand locked around his wrist, dragging him forward, refusing to let him fall behind. Gabriel led them, or thought he was leading them, but in the fog it was impossible to tell direction, impossible to know if they were running toward safety or deeper into whatever claimed this forest. Behind them, the footsteps continued, never speeding up, never slowing down, maintaining the same steady pace. Whatever was following them didn't need to run. It knew they had nowhere to go. It had all the time in the world. Literally. Gabriel heard his name. Not from behind him where his friends were, but from ahead, from deep in the fog, from a direction that made his stomach drop. His mother's voice clear as day with the slight accent of her native Portuguese. "Gabriel, honey, where are you? I've been looking everywhere for you. I was so worried." His mother, who was 3 states away in Texas. His mother, who would never be in these mountains. His mother, who he'd spoken to just that morning, who'd told him to be careful, to take his phone charger, to wear layers because the mountains got cold at night. But it sounded so real, so perfectly her. Down to the exact inflection on certain words, the slight catch in her voice when she was worried. The way she always said his name with the emphasis on the second syllable. He almost stopped, almost called back. His legs slowed, his mouth opening to respond, because what if it really was her? What if somehow she'd come looking for him? What if she needed help? But Sophia grabbed his jacket and hauled him forward with strength born of pure terror, her voice cutting through the fog and through his confusion. "Don't answer. Don't you dare answer it. She'd heard stories from her grandmother who'd grown up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, who'd survived the Depression by knowing the rules of these ancient places. Old stories about things that mimicked voices, that called to travelers in the shapes of loved ones, that wore familiar faces like masks. Things that waited for you to answer, to acknowledge them, to invite them in with your recognition. They ran harder, lungs burning, legs screaming. Isabella fell, her hands sinking into cold mud, and Brian hauled her up without stopping, all of them understanding on an instinctive level that to stop was to die, or worse. Because death wasn't the worst thing that could happen in these mountains. There were fates worse than death, things whispered about in the hollers and valleys, stories of people who came back wrong, who walked with their feet backwards, who spoke words that came out as screams, who ate nothing but raw meat and dirt and still never stopped being hungry. Then Brian heard his father's voice. His father who died when Brian was 12, who'd been gone for 13 years, who Brian still dreamed about sometimes. Brian, son, I've been waiting for you. I've missed you so much. Come here. Let me see you. And Brian's steps faltered, his eyes filling with tears, because God, he'd missed his father, missed him every day, and if there was even a chance. It's not real, Sophia screamed, gripping both her sister and her boyfriend, keeping them moving through sheer force of will. It's not real. It's not them. Keep running. But her own voice was breaking because now she heard her grandmother, her abuela who'd raised her, who'd died 2 years ago, calling to her in Spanish, and she wanted so desperately to believe it was real. The fog began to thin ahead, and they ran toward the lighter area like drowning people swimming toward the surface. Their lungs were fire, their legs barely responding to commands, but they ran. Behind them the footsteps continued, and now there were voices too, dozens of them, all calling out in the voices of loved ones, of people they'd known, of people they'd lost. A chorus of the familiar turned horrifying. They burst onto a road, paved, modern, real, with white and yellow lines and tire tracks and scattered gravel, and all the blessed mundane details of human civilization. They stood there panting, doubled over, trying not to vomit from the exertion, looking back at the tree line. The fog stopped at the edge of the forest as if hitting an invisible wall, a perfect line of demarcation between the normal world and whatever lay beyond. In its depths they could see shapes, tall, impossibly tall, standing motionless and watching. Gabriel counted them without meaning to, some compulsion making him assign a number. 12 figures, evenly spaced, forming a perfect semicircle, waiting, not moving, just watching with patience that felt geological in its scope. A park ranger truck pulled up, and Jean Hartley got out, her expression somewhere between resignation and pity, like she'd seen this before, like she'd seen this too many times. You kids okay? Her voice was gentle, the way you'd speak to trauma victims, to people who'd seen something they could never unsee. Come on, let's get you away from here. She moved between them and the tree line, her body language protective, and Gabriel noticed she didn't turn her back on the forest. She kept it in her peripheral vision, her hand resting on something at her belt. Not her radio, not her pepper spray, but something else. Something wrapped in leather that looked old and worn. They piled into the truck, all of them talking at once, trying to explain, their words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush to make sense of what had happened, to confirm with each other that it had been real, that they hadn't all had the same hallucination. John just drove, nodding occasionally, her weathered hands steady on the wheel, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror more often than necessary. When they reached the ranger station, she finally spoke. Let me guess. Saw a staircase. Time stopped. Heard voices you knew. Something followed you out. They stared at her, shocked into silence by how perfectly she'd summarized their nightmare. You're the 4th group this year. You're also the 4th group that made it out. You're lucky. Lucky? Isabella's voice cracked, and she realized she was shaking, her whole body trembling with shock and exhaustion. What do you mean lucky? What the hell was that? What's out there? Jean pulled out her notebook, flipped to a page covered in names and dates, written in different pens and pencils spanning years. Some entries were faded, others recent. Some names had been crossed out, Others had question marks. Others had notes scrawled beside them in handwriting that got progressively shakier. 17 people went missing on that trail in the last decade. We found 3 of them. She paused, choosing her words carefully, and Gabriel got the impression she was sharing more than she was supposed to, violating some unofficial policy about what rangers told the public. One was a woman named Jennifer Hatch, 32, experienced hiker, went up with proper gear and a satellite phone. She vanished on a Tuesday afternoon in June. We found her 4 days later sitting on a rock 12 miles from where she disappeared, barefoot, clothes torn off and scattered around her like she'd taken them off item by item while walking. No memory of how she got there. No memory of 4 days. Her feet were cut up, bloody like she'd walked the whole way barefoot over rough terrain. But she didn't remember any of it. She just remembered hearing her daughter calling for her. Her daughter, who was safely at home with her husband 2 states away. Another was a man named Marcus Chen, 28, software engineer, came up alone against all advice. We found him at the bottom of a ravine that search teams had checked 6 times. Checked it thoroughly, with dogs and thermal imaging. He wasn't there the first 6 times. On the 7th search, there he was, like someone had placed him there overnight. Been dead for maybe a day, the coroner said, but he'd been missing for 3 weeks. Where had he been for the other 20 days? What had happened to him? We'll never know. The 3rd? She paused, and her face went carefully blank, the look of someone accessing a memory they wished they didn't have. The 3rd was a young woman named Sarah Pritchard, 24, came up with friends for a bachelorette party. They were drunk, not paying attention, thought it would be funny to explore off the trail. Sarah vanished while her friends were taking selfies. They didn't notice she was gone for 15 minutes. We searched for 2 weeks, found nothing. Then, exactly 1 year later to the day, she appeared at the trailhead, right where the group had started their hike. Just standing there at dawn when a ranger arrived to open the gate. She looked exactly the same age, same clothes she'd been wearing, her supplies untouched, her water bottle still full. According to her, she'd only been gone for an hour. She thought her friends were playing a prank when we told her it had been a year. She didn't believe it until we showed her a calendar, showed her news articles about her disappearance. The look on her face. Jean shook her head. She left town the next day, changed her name. Last I heard, she moved to Arizona, as far from mountains as you can get. Gabriel felt sick. What about the others, the ones you didn't find? He wasn't sure he wanted to know, but he had to ask. Jean closed the notebook with a soft thud that felt final. We don't talk about the others, but sometimes hikers report seeing them, standing in the trees, standing on the staircases, still there, still waiting. She looked each of them in the eye, making sure they understood. Whatever you do, don't come back. Don't even think about coming back. Don't look up this trail online. Don't read about it. Don't talk about it more than you have to. And for God's sake, don't post anything about it on social media. This last was directed at Isabella. This mountain doesn't give second chances. You came back once. You won't come back twice. What is it? Sophia asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. What's out there? What did we encounter? Jean was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, almost reverent. The Cherokee who lived in these mountains before we did, they had rules. Don't whistle at night. Don't call out into the forest. Don't answer voices in the dark. If you see a staircase, don't acknowledge it, don't climb it, don't even look at it for too long. These mountains are old. Older than humanity. There are things here that were here before us and will be here after us. Things that don't think the way we do, don't see the world the way we do. To them, we're insects, maybe, or toys, or food. I don't know. Nobody knows. The old rangers, the ones who've been working these mountains for 40, 50 years, they have their theories. But theories don't help much when you're face to face with something that shouldn't exist. They left the Appalachians that night, driving nonstop, taking turns at the wheel, none of them able to sleep even when they tried. Isabella deleted all her footage. Hours of recording that showed nothing but static and the occasional glimpse of something pale moving between trees. Something with too many joints, something that moved in ways that made your eyes hurt to watch. Brian's watch never worked right again, sometimes running forward, sometimes back, sometimes stopping for hours at a time before suddenly jumping ahead. He stopped wearing it after a week, threw it in a drawer, but sometimes late at night he'd hear it ticking, that steady backward tick counting down to something. Sophia had nightmares for months, always the same. Standing in fog while something wearing her face watched from the trees, wearing her skin like a suit, learning how to be her, getting better at it each night until she couldn't tell which one was real. She started sleeping with the lights on, started carrying sage and salt and iron nails in her purse, things her grandmother had taught her about but that she'd always dismissed as superstition. She wasn't dismissing it anymore. Gabriel changed his major to business administration. He never went hiking again, never went camping, barely even walked in city parks. He threw out all his gear, his tent and sleeping bag and camp stove, his topo maps and field guides. He threw out his textbooks about ecology and environmental systems. He couldn't look at forests anymore without feeling watched, without remembering those shapes in the fog, without hearing his mother's voice calling him from somewhere he should never have been. But sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep, when the memory of that day was too fresh and too real, he'd look at the compass he'd carried that day. He'd kept it, though he couldn't have said why. The needle would be spinning slowly, pointing insistently toward the northwest, toward the mountains, as if something there was still calling to him. Still waiting for him to come back and finish what he'd started. Still patient, because it had all the time in the world. Because time meant nothing there. Because what were days or months or years to something that had existed since before humans learned to stand upright and walk. Isabella posted one video about the experience, vague and careful, not mentioning the location or specifics, just talking about how some places in nature deserved respect, deserved fear, how not everything could be filmed and posted and turned into content. Her comments filled up with people calling her a fraud, saying she'd sold out, saying she'd lost her edge. She deleted the video after a week, deleted her whole channel after a month. The last time Gabriel saw her, she was working at a coffee shop in Charlotte. Her hair dyed back to brown, the green completely gone. She didn't recognize him at first, and when she did, they didn't talk about the mountains. They didn't talk about that day. They just exchanged pleasantries and went their separate ways, both of them understanding that some things were better left unspoken. The Appalachian Mountains are older than bones, older than memory, older than the concept of age itself. They were ancient when the first humans walked across the land bridge from Asia, and they'll be there long after the last human dies. And in their hollows and valleys, in the deep green places where sunlight barely reaches, in the pockets of space where time doesn't flow quite right, things wait that have always been waiting, things that know patience better than any living creature, things that see a human lifetime as nothing more than a brief, flickering moment, like a firefly's flash in the dark. And they're always, always watching, waiting for the next person who doesn't believe, who thinks themselves too smart or too rational or too modern to be affected by superstition, waiting for the next person who sees a staircase and thinks I should take a picture, waiting for the next person who hears a voice calling and thinks, maybe it's real. The mountains are patient. They have nothing but time, and time, in those deep green places, is a circle. Every moment happening at once, every disappearance still happening, every victim still running, still hearing voices, still standing at the edge of the fog wondering whether to turn back, still being watched, always being watched. Jean Hartley updates her notebook every season, adds new names, crosses out old ones, writes notes about where they were found and how they were found, and what state they were in when they came back, if they came back. She's been doing this for 30 years and the notebook is almost full. She's already bought a new one. The pages are blank, but she knows they won't stay that way. The mountains are hungry, and they're always, always patient. The Trail That Remembers. The last photograph of Daniel Hewitt showed him smiling at the Ravens Peak trailhead, his arm around his fiancée Rebecca Walsh, both of them wearing matching university hoodies and looking absurdly happy. The timestamp read 7:23 a.m. on a crisp Saturday in late September. By 3 p.m. that same day, only Rebecca would walk out of those mountains and she would never be the same. Daniel was 29, a high school chemistry teacher with a passion for amateur photography and a tendency to see the best in every situation. He had sandy brown hair that never stayed combed, glasses he was constantly pushing up his nose, and an infectious laugh that made everyone around him smile. He'd proposed to Rebecca 3 months earlier on a beach in North Carolina, and they'd planned this hiking trip as a celebration before the chaos of wedding planning consumed their lives. Rebecca, 27, worked as a graphic designer from home, which meant she spent most of her time indoors staring at screens. This hike was Daniel's idea: get some fresh air, disconnect from technology, reconnect with nature. She'd agreed because she loved him, even though her idea of adventure was trying a new coffee shop. They weren't alone on this trip. Daniel's younger brother Marcus had invited himself along, bringing his boyfriend James Chen. Marcus was 24, fresh out of college, working in marketing and carrying the kind of unearned confidence that came from never having faced real consequences. He was tall, athletic, with their father's dark hair and their mother's sharp cheekbones. He posted constantly on social media, documenting every meal, every moment, every mundane detail of his life for his 15,000 followers. James was quieter, 26, an architect with careful hands and an observant nature. He'd grown up in San Francisco, the son of immigrants who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. He noticed things others missed: the way buildings aged, the patterns in nature, the small details that told larger stories. The fifth member of their group was Daniel's old college roommate, Trevor Banks, a perpetually single 30-year-old who worked in finance and approached hiking the same way he approached everything else: as a competition to be won. He had expensive gear he barely knew how to use, designer hiking boots that had never touched actual trail before, and the kind of aggressive enthusiasm that came from spending too much time in gyms and not enough time in actual wilderness. They started the hike with the casual confidence of people who'd checked the weather forecast and read a few blog posts about the trail. The morning was beautiful, the kind of perfect autumn day that made you understand why people wrote poems about New England and the Appalachians. The leaves were turning, brilliant reds and oranges and yellows that seemed almost artificial in their intensity. The air smelled like wood smoke from distant cabins and the rich, loamy scent of earth preparing for winter. "This is going to be epic," Marcus said, already filming with his phone, panning across the trailhead sign. Day 1 of our Appalachian adventure, Daniel and Rebecca's last hurrah before they become boring married people. He grinned at the camera, then at his brother, who rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "We're not going to become boring," Rebecca said, but her smile was uncertain. She'd never been comfortable on camera, never understood Marcus's need to document everything. She preferred to experience moments privately, to hold them close rather than broadcast them. Trevor was already ahead on the trail, power walking as if this was a race, checking his fitness tracker every few minutes. "Come on, people. We've got 12 miles to cover today if we want to make it to the shelter before dark." His voice echoed through the trees, too loud, startling birds from their perches. James walked beside Rebecca, moving at her pace, which she appreciated. "First time hiking in the Appalachians?" he asked quietly. His voice was soft, unassuming, the kind of voice that made you lean in to hear better. "First time really hiking anywhere," she admitted. "I'm not exactly outdoorsy. Daniel's been trying to change that." She looked ahead to where Daniel was adjusting his camera, trying to capture the light filtering through the canopy. He was in his element out here, away from lesson plans and parent-teacher conferences, just him and his camera and the natural world he loved so much. "The mountains are beautiful," James said, "but they demand respect. My grandfather used to tell me that. He grew up in rural China, in the mountains there. He said mountains are older than humanity and they don't forget." Rebecca felt a small chill despite the warm morning. "Don't forget what?" James shrugged, but his expression was serious. "Everything. Every person who's walked them. Every person who's disappeared in them. Mountains have long memories." The trail started easy enough, wide, well-marked, gentle elevation gain. They passed other hikers going the opposite direction, exchanged cheerful good mornings and trail information. A couple in their 60s warned them about a muddy section ahead. A young woman with a dog told them the views from Raven's Peak were worth the climb. Everything felt normal, safe, exactly what you'd expect from a popular hiking trail on a beautiful autumn day. They stopped for lunch around noon at a scenic overlook where the trail opened up to reveal miles of forested mountains rolling away in every direction like green waves frozen in time. Marcus took group photos, made everyone pose multiple times until he got the shot he wanted for Instagram. Trevor complained about the pace, said they should have covered more distance by now. Daniel and Rebecca sat a little apart from the others, sharing a sandwich and speaking in the quiet voices of people comfortable with each other's silence. "You having fun?" Daniel asked, tucking a strand of hair behind Rebecca's ear. "Yeah," she said, and realized she meant it. "It's peaceful out here. I can see why you love it. Wait until you see the sunset from the shelter. It's supposed to be incredible." He squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, neither of them knowing it would be the last normal moment they'd share. They continued hiking after lunch, and that's when things began to feel wrong. Subtle at first, James noticed it before the others. The bird song, which had been constant all morning, stopped, not gradually but all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. The forest fell into a silence so complete it felt physical, pressing against their eardrums. "That's weird," Marcus said, lowering his phone. Even he felt it, the sudden wrongness in the air. "Probably just means there's a bear nearby," Trevor said dismissively. But his hand moved to the bear spray on his belt. "They'll avoid us if we make noise." He started talking loudly about his workout routine, his voice jarring in the stillness. But James was looking around, his architect's eye for detail catching something the others missed. The trees looked different. Not wrong exactly, but arranged differently than they had been. The trail itself seemed narrower. The blazes on the trees, the painted marks that indicated the official path, were faded in a way they hadn't been an hour ago. Daniel had stopped walking, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" His voice was quiet, uncertain. This wasn't like him. Daniel was the optimist, the one who always found the bright side. Rebecca felt it too. That prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the ancient instinct that warned prey animals about predators. She turned slowly, scanning the forest around them. Nothing but trees and shadows and fallen leaves, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. "We should keep moving," James said. His voice was calm, but Rebecca saw tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept darting to the spaces between trees. They walked faster now, the easy camaraderie of the morning replaced by an unspoken anxiety. Trevor had stopped checking his fitness tracker. Marcus had stopped filming. They moved in a tight group, unconsciously drawing closer together, some primitive part of their brains understanding that separation meant danger. That's when they saw it. Marcus stopped walking so abruptly that James bumped into him. "What the hell is that?" Marcus whispered, pointing. About 40 yards off the trail, standing in a small clearing, was a deer. At least it looked like a deer at first glance. It had the general shape, 4 legs, a body, a head. But something was wrong. The proportions were off. The legs bent at angles that weren't quite right. The neck was too long. And when it turned its head to look at them, the movement was mechanical, jerky, like a puppet being manipulated by an amateur. "That's not a deer," James said flatly. "We need to move, now. Don't run, but walk quickly, and don't look at it." "What do you mean it's not a deer?" Trevor demanded. "It's obviously a deer, probably sick or something." But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. They could all see it now, the wrongness of the thing. Its eyes were too large, too forward-facing. Its mouth hung open slightly, and inside were too many teeth, too sharp, arranged in rows like a shark's. The not deer took a step toward them. Its movement was all wrong, like it was learning to walk, like it had studied deer movement but couldn't quite replicate it correctly. Another step, then another. Slow, deliberate, watching them with those 2 large eyes. "Go," Daniel said, his voice tight. "Go now." They moved quickly, not quite running, but close to it. Behind them, they heard the knot deer following, its hooves making sounds that weren't quite right on the forest floor. Too heavy, too rhythmic, like deliberate footsteps rather than the natural gait of an animal. Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest. She was breathing hard, her city-soft lungs protesting the sudden exertion. Daniel gripped her hand, pulling her along, and she was grateful for his strength because her legs felt like water. The trail ahead split in a Y formation. Trevor went left without consulting anyone, and Marcus followed him, still filming now, his phone held up shakily. "Wait," Daniel called. "We shouldn't split up." But it was too late. Trevor and Marcus were already disappearing around a bend, moving fast. Daniel, Rebecca, and James took the right fork. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had stopped. The forest was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Expectant, hungry, like a predator holding its breath. They walked for what felt like hours, but according to their watches was only 15 minutes. The trail was narrow now, overgrown, branches reaching across like grasping fingers. This didn't look like a maintained trail anymore. The blazes had disappeared entirely. "We're lost," Rebecca said, fighting down panic. "We took a wrong turn somewhere." Daniel checked his GPS. The screen showed their location jumping wildly, placing them in Tennessee, then Virginia, then West Virginia, sometimes all within seconds. The altitude reading fluctuated impossibly, claiming they were simultaneously at 2,000 feet and 6,500 feet. Technology's not helping. The iron in the mountains must be interfering with the signal. But James was looking at something else, his face pale. "Look at your watch," he said quietly. They all checked. Daniel's watch read 2:17 p.m. Rebecca's phone showed 2:17 p.m. James's old analog watch, a gift from his grandfather, read 2:17 p.m. But that was impossible. They'd been walking for hours since lunch. The sun's position in the sky said it should be at least 4 p.m., maybe later. "Time's not working right," James said. He'd pulled something from his pocket, a small charm on a red string, Chinese characters carved into jade. "My grandfather gave me this. He said it would protect me in the mountains. I thought it was just superstition." He gripped it tightly, his knuckles white. A sound echoed through the forest. Marcus's voice, calling for help. It came from ahead of them, from deeper in the woods. "Please, someone help me. I'm hurt." Daniel started moving toward the voice immediately, but James grabbed his arm. "Don't. That's not your brother." "What are you talking about? That's Marcus. He needs help." "Listen to the voice," James insisted. "Really listen." They stood still, and the voice came again. "Daniel, Rebecca, where are you? I need help." And now that they were paying attention, they could hear it. The wrongness. The inflection was slightly off. The desperation sounded rehearsed, performed. It was Marcus's voice, but it was like someone had recorded him and was playing it back, or like something had learned to imitate him but couldn't quite get the nuances right. "Please, I'm bleeding. Something attacked me." The voice was closer now, moving toward them through the trees, but they couldn't see anyone. Just the voice, disembodied, calling out with Marcus's mouth but with something else behind it. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. "What's happening? What is this place?" Daniel held her close, his own hands shaking. "I don't know, but we're not splitting up, and we're not following that voice." He looked at James. "You seem to know something about this. What do we do?" James was muttering something under his breath. Prayers, maybe, or words in Mandarin that Rebecca didn't understand. "My grandfather's stories. I thought they were just stories. He talked about mountains in China that were older than civilization, places where the rules were different. He said there were things that lived in those places, things that existed before humans and would exist after us, things that mimicked and copied and wore familiar shapes to lure people away from safety. So what do we do?" Daniel's voice was desperate now. "How do we get out?" "We find running water. My grandfather said these things can't cross running water. We find a stream and we follow it down the mountain." James looked around, trying to orient himself. Water flows downhill. If we go down, we'll eventually find a stream, and that stream will lead to a river, and a river will lead to people. They started moving downhill, off the trail entirely now, scrambling through underbrush and over fallen logs. Behind them, Marcus's voice continued calling, but now it was joined by others. Trevor's voice. Guys, where'd everyone go? This isn't funny. James's voice. Daniel, Rebecca, I found the way back. And worst of all, Rebecca heard her own voice calling out to Daniel, heard herself saying, Honey, I'm scared, please find me. In a tone that was almost right, but not quite, like a photocopy of a photocopy. Don't listen, James said. Keep moving, don't answer, don't acknowledge them. If you respond, you give them permission. That's how these things work. They need you to acknowledge them, to accept them as real. The slope got steeper. Rebecca slipped, skinning her palms on rocks, and Daniel caught her. They could hear water now, the blessed sound of a stream somewhere below them. They moved faster, desperate, branches catching their clothes and drawing blood that they didn't feel in their panic to escape. And then they found something that stopped them cold. A staircase, rising from the forest floor like it had grown there, like it was as natural as the trees around it. But this wasn't natural at all. It was carpeted in deep blue fabric, had brass railings polished to a shine, and rose up into the canopy, disappearing into the leaves. Victorian style, ornate, completely impossible. Don't look at it, James said immediately. Don't acknowledge it. Walk around it, but don't look at it. Don't touch it. Don't even think about it too hard. But Daniel had stopped, his photographer's eye caught by the wrongness of it. This doesn't make sense. How did someone build this out here? When? Why? He raised his camera, instinctively framing a shot. Daniel, no! Rebecca grabbed his arm. Please, let's just go. He lowered the camera, but as he did, something moved on the staircase. A figure descending slowly. It wore a park ranger uniform, looked perfectly normal at first glance. But as it got closer, they could see the wrongness. Its feet didn't quite touch the steps. It moved without the natural sway of walking. And its face, though human-shaped, had eyes that reflected light like an animal's. You folks need help? It asked in a voice that sounded like it was coming from a record player. Slightly warped, slightly wrong. These woods are dangerous. Let me escort you back to the trail. Run, James said. Now. They ran. The knot ranger called after them, its voice shifting, becoming deeper, more authoritative, more commanding. Stop. That's an order. These mountains are closed. You're trespassing. They crashed through brush, sliding down the steep slope, and suddenly they broke through a line of trees, and there it was, a stream, narrow but fast-moving, water dancing over rocks in the fading afternoon light. They splashed into it without hesitation, the cold water shocking after their panicked flight. They followed it downstream, staying in the water even though it soaked their boots and made every step treacherous. Behind them, at the water's edge, shapes gathered. Tall figures with wrong proportions, the knot deer, the knot ranger. Things that looked almost human but moved like they were wearing human skin as a costume. They stood at the water's edge but didn't cross. Just watched with two bright eyes as the three hikers stumbled downstream. The stream widened, became a creek, then joined with another creek to become a small river. The sun was setting now, painting the sky orange and pink, and in that fading light they saw something beautiful and mundane and miraculous. A bridge, a real bridge, metal and concrete, with traffic sounds and the smell of exhaust. They climbed up the embankment, muddy and bleeding and exhausted, and found themselves on a two-lane highway. A car passed, then another. Real, normal, human. Rebecca started laughing and crying at the same time, the relief so overwhelming she thought she might collapse. A state police car pulled over, lights flashing. A trooper got out, a woman in her 40s with gray in her hair and a concerned expression. You folks okay? You look like you've been through hell. We got lost, Daniel managed. On the Ravens Peak Trail. We need to report. There are two others still out there. Marcus Hewitt and Trevor Banks. The trooper's expression changed. became more serious. She called it in on her radio, then looked at them carefully. "You said Raven's Peak Trail? That trail's been closed for 2 years, since the disappearances." She paused. "When did you start your hike?" "This morning," Rebecca said, "around 7:30. The trooper checked her watch. "Ma'am, it's 6:45 p.m. on Sunday. You've been missing for over 35 hours. They stared at her. That was impossible. They'd only been hiking for 1 day. They'd eaten lunch just hours ago. But their phones, when they checked, confirmed it. Sunday, September 29th, 6:47 p.m. An entire day had passed, a day they couldn't remember, a day that didn't exist in their memories. The search for Marcus and Trevor lasted 3 weeks. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers from nearby towns. Nothing. No trace, no footprints, no torn clothing. It was as if they'd simply vanished into air. Daniel walked with the search parties every day, calling his brother's name until his voice gave out. But the mountain gave back no answers. On the 19th day, a hiker found Marcus's phone on a rock by the trail, perfectly centered, deliberately placed. It was fully charged, which made no sense after 3 weeks. The last video on it was time-stamped from the day they disappeared, shot at 2:17 p.m., the exact time when time had stopped for the others. The video was shaky. Marcus running through the forest, breathing hard. "Trevor, where are you, man?" His voice was scared. The camera swung wildly, catching glimpses of trees, sky, and something else. Tall figures moving between the trunks, keeping pace with him effortlessly. "There's something following me, multiple somethings. They look like..." The video cut to static. When it came back 5 seconds later, everything was different. Marcus was standing still, the camera aimed at his own face. But his expression was wrong. Blank. Empty. And when he spoke, his voice had that same recorded quality, that same wrongness. "I think I'll stay here. The mountains are beautiful. I belong here now." Behind him, barely visible in the frame, was a staircase, and on that staircase, standing perfectly still, was Trevor, or something wearing Trevor's face. The video ended. Trevor's body was found 4 months later by a ranger doing a routine patrol, sitting against a tree in an area that had been searched dozens of times. He'd been dead for weeks, the coroner said, though missing for months. His clothes were neatly folded beside him. His expensive hiking boots were placed toe-to-toe, laces tied. His face was serene, eyes open, looking up at something in the canopy that no one else could see. Marcus was never found. His parents held a memorial service without a body. Daniel spoke at it, though he could barely get through his prepared remarks. He talked about his little brother, about their childhood, about all the things Marcus would never get to do now. He didn't mention the mountains, didn't mention what they'd encountered. Some things couldn't be explained, could barely be believed even by those who'd experienced them. Daniel and Rebecca postponed the wedding, then canceled it. Not because they didn't love each other, but because something had broken in both of them that day. Rebecca couldn't sleep without lights on, couldn't be in quiet spaces without panic rising in her throat. She'd wake up screaming about voices calling her name, about staircases in impossible places, about her own face watching her from the trees. Daniel stopped taking photographs, stopped teaching. He couldn't stand being in classrooms surrounded by walls, trapped, but he couldn't go outside either, couldn't look at trees without seeing shapes moving between them. He started drinking, just a little at first, then more, trying to blur the memories that wouldn't fade. They broke up 6 months after the incident. It was amicable, sad, inevitable. They'd tried to support each other through the trauma, but instead they'd just reinforced it, each one reminding the other of what they'd lost, what they'd seen, what they could never forget or explain or escape. James left San Francisco and moved to Phoenix, to the desert where there were no trees, no mountains, no places for things to hide and watch. He saw a therapist who specialized in trauma, though he never told her the full truth of what happened. How could he? She'd think he was delusional. He carried his grandfather's jade charm everywhere, never took it off, and sometimes late at night he'd call his grandmother in China and ask her to tell him the old stories, the warnings, the rules. she'd tell him, her voice patient and sad, and he'd feel a little safer hearing them, even though he knew safety was an illusion. The mountains remembered. They always remembered. Rebecca moved to Miami, as far south as she could get while staying in America, to a place where it was flat and hot and urban. She changed careers, started working with children, trying to find innocence again, trying to convince herself the world was a safe place despite knowing it wasn't. She never went near mountains, never even drove through them. When she flew to visit family in Ohio, she booked flights that went around the Appalachians, not over them, and paid extra for the longer route. But still, sometimes she'd hear it, faintly, like a radio station barely in range. Marcus's voice calling her name, Daniel's voice asking where she was, her own voice saying things she'd never said. The mountains were 1,000 miles away, but distance didn't matter. She'd been touched by something old and patient and hungry, and it hadn't forgotten her. It never would. Daniel lasted 3 years before the drinking got bad enough that his parents intervened. Rehab helped, therapy helped, medication helped. He got sober, got stable, got a job teaching again at a different school. He met someone new, a kind woman named Sarah who worked at the library and knew nothing about hiking or mountains or his past. He told her he'd lost his brother, which was true, but not how. She didn't push for details, and he was grateful. But sometimes, late at night, he'd wake up from dreams of staircases and fog and things with his brother's face. He'd check his phone compulsively, half expecting to see a message from Marcus, even though Marcus's number had been disconnected years ago. Once, he thought he saw Marcus in a crowd downtown. Same height, same build, same way of walking. He'd followed the figure for 3 blocks before losing it in the crowd, his heart hammering, sweat running down his back despite the cold. He never told Sarah about it, never told anyone. The Appalachian Mountains continue standing, patient and eternal. The trail at Raven's Peak remains officially closed, though occasionally hikers ignore the signs and barriers and venture in anyway. Some come back with stories about strange silences and compass malfunctions. Others talk about hearing voices or seeing staircases, and some don't come back at all. Park rangers find their belongings sometimes, clothes folded neatly, boots placed just so, phones fully charged with final videos that show nothing but static, and, if you look closely, shapes in the background that might be human or might be something else entirely. The rangers add names to their lists, update their databases, brief search and rescue teams, and the old ones, the ones who've worked these mountains for decades, they keep their own records, notebooks filled with names and dates and patterns that make no sense but are undeniably there. Disappearances that cluster around certain dates, areas where people vanish more frequently, trails where the rules of reality grow thin. Jean Hartley, who'd driven Rebecca, Daniel, and James away from the mountains that day, retired 2 years later. Her replacement found her notebooks in a locked drawer, page after page of documentation, theories, warnings. He read through them once, then locked them away again. Some knowledge was too dangerous to share widely. Some truths couldn't be spoken aloud without inviting the attention of the things those truths described. The mountains remember everything. Every hiker who's walked their trails, every person who's disappeared into their green depths, every moment of fear and wonder and death. They remember because they are memory, because they are time itself made solid, because they existed before the concept of forgetting was invented. And in their deepest places, in the hollows and valleys where sunlight struggles to reach, things wait that have always been waiting. Things that were old when humanity was young. Things that see our lives as brief flickers of light in an eternal darkness. Things that are patient because patience is all they have, because what are decades or centuries to something that has existed for millions of years? They watch, they wait, they remember. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, when someone ventures too far or stays too long or breaks one of the unspoken rules, they reach out. They touch. They take. The mountains are always hungry, and they never ever forget.